51. Title redacted, PT1. Saturday. Harry had run into trouble falling asleep Friday night, which he had anticipated might happen, and so he had decided to take the obvious advanced precaution of buying a sleeping potion. And to prevent it from constituting a visible sign that he was nervous, he had decided to buy it off Fred and George a couple of months earlier. Be prepared. That's the Boy Scouts' marching song. Thus Harry was fully rested, and his pouch contained almost everything which he owned and might conceivably need. Harry had, in fact, run into the volume limitation on the pouch, and keeping in mind that he would need to store a large snake and might need to store who knew what else, he had removed some of the bulkier items, like the car battery. He was up to the point now where he could transfigure something the size of a car battery in 4 minutes flat, so it wasn't much of a loss. Harry had kept the emergency flares and the oxyacetylene welding torch and fuel tank, since you couldn't just transfigure things that were to be burned. Be prepared, as through life you march along. Mary's place. After the waitress had taken their order and bowed to them and left the room, Professor Quirrell had performed only 4 charms, and then they talked about nothing of any vast consequence, just Professor Quirrell's complex thesis about how the Dark Lord's curse on the defense position had led to the decline of dueling, and how this had changed social customs in magical Britain. Harry listened and nodded and said intelligent things, while he tried to control the pounding of his heart. Then the waitress came in again bearing their food, and this time, a minute after the waitress had departed, Professor Quirrell gestured for the door to close and lock, and began to speak 29 security charms, one of the ones in Mr. Bestir's sequence being left out this time, which somewhat puzzled Harry. Professor Quirrell finished his charms, stood up from his chair, blurred into a green snake, banded in blue and white, hissed, "Hungry, boy. Eat your fill swiftly, we shall need both strength and time." Harry's eyes were a bit wide, but he hissed, "I ate well at breakfast," and then rapidly began forking noodles into his mouth. The snake watched him for a moment with those flat eyes and then hissed, "Do not wish to explain here. Prefer to be elsewhere first. Need to leave unobserved. Without sign we have ever departed room." "SSO no one can track us," hissed Harry. "Yes. Do you trust me that much, boy? Think before answer. I will have important request of you which requires trust. If say no regardless, then say no now." Harry dropped his gaze from the snake's flat eyes and looked back down at his sauce-coated noodles and ate another bite, then another while he thought. The defense professor was an ambiguous figure, to put it mildly. Harry thought he had unraveled some of his goals, but others remained mysterious. But Professor Quirrell had knocked down 200 girls to stop the ones summoning Harry. Professor Quirrell had deduced that the Dementor was draining Harry through his wand. The defense professor had saved Harry's life, twice, in a 2-week period, which could mean that the defense professor was just saving Harry for later, that there were ulterior motives. Indeed, it was certain that there were ulterior motives. Professor Quirrell wasn't doing this on a whim. But then Professor Quirrell had also seen Harry taught occlumency. He had taught Harry how to lose. If the defense professor wanted to make some use of Harry Potter, it was a use that required a strengthened Harry Potter, not a weakened one. That was what it meant to be used by a friend, that they would want the use to make you stronger instead of weaker. And if there was sometimes a cold atmosphere about the defense professor, bitterness in his voice, or emptiness in his gaze, then Harry was the only one who Professor Quirrell allowed to see it. Harry didn't quite know how to describe in words the sense of kinship he felt with Professor Quirrell, except to say that the defense professor was the only clear-thinking person Harry had met in the wizarding world. Sooner or later, everyone else started playing Quidditch, or not putting protective shells on their time machines, or thinking that death was their friend. It didn't matter how good their intentions were. Sooner or later, and usually sooner, they demonstrated that something deep inside their brain was confused. Everyone except Professor Quirrell. It was a bond that went beyond anything of debts owed, or even anything of personal liking, that the two of them were alone in the wizarding world. And if the defense professor occasionally seemed a little scary or a little dark, well, that was just the same thing some people said about Harry. "I trust you," hissed Harry, and the snake explained the first stage of the plan. Harry took a final forkful of noodles chewed. Beside him, Professor Quirrell, now in human form again, was eating his soup placidly, as though nothing of special interest were occurring. Then Harry swallowed, and in the same moment stood up from his chair, already feeling his heart start to hammer hard in his chest. The security precautions they were taking were literally the most stringent possible. "Are you ready to test it, Mr. Potter?" Professor Quirrell said calmly. It wasn't a test, but Professor Quirrell wouldn't say that, not out loud in human speech, even in this room screened to the limit that Professor Quirrell had secured with further charms. "Yep," Harry said as casually as he could. Step 1. Harry said cloak to his pouch, drew forth the cloak of invisibility, and then unstuck the pouch from his belt and threw it toward the other side of the table. The defense professor stood up from his own seat, drew his wand, bent down, and touched his wand to the pouch, murmuring a quiet incantation. The new enchantments would ensure that Professor Quirrell could enter the pouch on his own in snake form and leave it on his own, and hear what went on outside while he was in the pouch. Step 2. As Professor Quirrell stood up from where he bent over by the pouch and put away his wand happened to point in Harry's direction, and there was a brief crawling sensation on Harry's chest near where the time-turner lay, like something creepy had passed very close by without touching him. Step 3. The defense professor turned into a snake again, and the sense of doom diminished. The snake crawled to the pouch and into it, the pouch's mouth opening to admit the green shape, and as the mouth closed again behind the tail, the sense of doom diminished further. Step 4. Harry drew his wand, being careful to stand still as he did it, so that the time-turner would not move from where Professor Quirrell had anchored the hourglass within the shell in its current orientation. "Wingardium Leviosa," murmured Harry, and the pouch began to float toward him. Slowly, slowly, as Professor Quirrell had instructed, the pouch began to float toward Harry, who waited alert for any sign the pouch was opening, in which case Harry was to use the hover charm to propel it away from him as fast as possible. As the pouch came within a meter of Harry, the sense of doom returned. As Harry reattached the pouch to his belt, the sense of doom was stronger than it had ever been, but still not overwhelming. It was tolerable, even with Professor Quirrell's animagus form lying within the extended space of the pouch, resting on Harry's very hip. Step 5. Harry sheathed his wand. His other hand still held the cloak of invisibility, and Harry drew that cloak over himself. Step 6. And so in that room, shielded from every possible scrying, which Professor Quirrell had personally and further secured, it was not until after Harry was wearing the true cloak of invisibility that he reached beneath his shirt and twisted the outer shell of the time-turner just once. The time-turner's inner hourglass stayed anchored and motionless. The setting twisted around it. The food vanished from the table. The chairs leaped back into place. The door sprang open. Mary's room was deserted, as it should have been, because Professor Quirrell had earlier contacted Mary's place under a false name to inquire whether the room would be available at this hour. Not to reserve it, not to place a cancelled reservation that might be noted, but only to inquire. Step 7. Staying under the cloak of invisibility, Harry left through the open door. He navigated the tiled hallways of Mary's place to the well-stocked bar that greeted new entrants, tended by the owner, Jake. There were only a few people at the bar in the morning before proper lunchtime, and Harry had to wait invisibly by the door for several minutes, listening to the murmur of conversation and the gurgle of alcohol, before the door opened to admit a huge, genial Irishman, and Harry slipped out silently in his wake. Step 8. Harry walked for a while. He was well away from Mary's place when he turned off Diagon Alley into a smaller alley, at the end of which lay a shop that was dark, the windows enchanted to blackness. Step 9. "Swordfish melon friend." Harry spoke the passphrase to the lark, and it clicked open. Within the shop was also darkness, the light from the open door briefly illuminating it to show a wide, empty room. The furniture shop which had once operated here had gone bankrupt a few months ago, according to the defense professor, and the shop had been repossessed, but not yet resold. The walls were painted a simple white, the wooden floor scratched and unpolished, a single closed door set in the back wall. This had been a showroom once, but now it showed nothing. The door clicked shut behind Harry, and then the darkness was pitch and complete. Step 10. Harry took out his wand and said, "Lumos," lighting the room with white glow. He took his pouch from his belt, the the sense of doom growing a little sharper as he grasped it with his fingers and lightly tossed it to the opposite side of the room, the sense of doom fading almost completely. And then he began to take off the cloak of invisibility, even as his voice hissed, "It is done." Step 11. From the pouch poked a green head, followed shortly by a meter-long green body as the snake slithered out. A moment later, the snake blurred into Professor Quirrell. Step 12. Harry waited in silence while the defense professor recited 30 charms. "All right," Professor Quirrell said calmly when he had finished. "If anyone is still watching us now, we are in any case doomed, so I will speak plainly and in human form. Parseltongue does not quite suit me, I fear, as I am neither a descendant of Salazar nor a true snake." Harry nodded. "So, Mr. Potter," said Professor Quirrell, his gaze intent, his pale blue eyes dark and shadowed in the white light coming from Harry's wand. "We are alone and unobserved, and I have an important question to ask you." "Go ahead," said Harry, his heart starting to beat faster. "What is your opinion of the government of magical Britain?" That wasn't quite what Harry had been expecting, but it was close enough, so Harry said, "Based on my limited knowledge, I would say that both the Ministry and the Wisengamot appear to be stupid, corrupt, and evil." "Correct," Professor Quirrell said. "Do you understand why I ask?" Harry took a deep breath and looked Professor Quirrell straight in the eyes, unflinching. Harry had finally worked out that the way to make amazing deductions from scanty evidence was to know the answer in advance, and he had guessed this answer fully a week ago. It needed only a slight adjustment. "You're about to invite me to join a secret organization full of interesting people like yourself," said Harry, "one of whose goals is to reform or overthrow the government of magical Britain, and yes, I'm in." There was a slight pause. "I'm afraid that is not quite where I intended to direct this conversation," said Professor Quirrell. The corners of his lips were twitching slightly. "I merely plan to ask for your help in doing something extremely treasonous and illegal." "Darn," thought Harry. Still, Professor Quirrell hadn't denied it. "Go on." "Before I do," said Professor Quirrell. There was no levity in his voice now. "Are you open to such requests, Mr. Potter?" "I say again that if you are likely to say no regardless, you must say no now. If your curiosity impels you otherwise, squash it." "Treasonous and illegal doesn't bother me," said Harry. "Risks bother me and the stakes would need to be commensurate, but I can't imagine you taking risks frivolously." Professor Quirrell nodded. "I would not. It is a terrible abuse of my friendship with you, and of such trust as is placed in my teaching position at Hogwarts." "You can skip this part," Harry said. The lips twitched again, and then went flat. "Then I shall skip it. Mr. Potter, you sometimes make a game of lying with truths, playing with words to conceal your meanings in plain sight. I, too, have been known to find that amusing. But if I so much as tell you what I hope we shall do this day, Mr. Potter, you will lie about it. You will lie straight out, without hesitation, without wordplay or hints, to anyone who asks about it, be they foe or closest friend. You will lie to Malfoy, to Granger, and to McGonagall. You will speak, always and without hesitation, in exactly the fashion you would speak if you knew nothing, with no concern for your honor. That also is how it must be." There was silence then for a time. That was a price measured in a fraction of Harry's soul. "Without telling me yet," said Harry, "can you say if the need is desperate?" "There is someone in the most terrible want of your help," Professor Quirrell said simply, "and there is no one who can help them but you." There was another silence, but not a long one. "All right," Harry said quietly. "Tell me of the mission." The dark robes of the defense professor seemed to blur against the shadow on the wall, cast by his silhouette blocking the white light of Harry's wand. "The ordinary Patronus charm, Mr. Potter, wards off a Dementor's fear. But the Dementors still see you through it. They know that you are there. Only not your Patronus charm. It blinds them, or more than blinds them. What I saw beneath the cloak wasn't even looking in our direction as you killed it, as though it had forgotten our existence, even as it died." Harry nodded. That wasn't surprising, not when you confronted a Dementor on the level of its true existence, beyond anthropomorphism. Death might be the last enemy, but it wasn't a sentient enemy. When humanity had wiped out smallpox, smallpox hadn't fought back. "Mr. Potter, the central branch of Gringotts is guarded by every spell high and low that the goblins know. Even so, those vaults have been successfully robbed. For what wizardry can do, wizardry can undo. And yet no one has ever escaped from Azkaban. No one. For every charm there is a counter-charm. For every ward there is a bypass. How can it be that no one has ever been rescued from Azkaban? Because Azkaban has something invincible, Harry said. Something so terrible that no one can defeat it. That was the keystone of their perfect security. It had to be nothing human. It was death that guarded Azkaban. The Dementors don't like their meals being taken away from them, Professor Quirrell said. Coldness had entered that voice now. They know if anyone tries. There are more than 100 Dementors there, and they speak to the guards as well. It's that simple, Mr. Potter. If you're a powerful wizard, then Azkaban isn't hard to enter, and it isn't hard to leave, so long as you don't try to take anything out of it that belongs to the Dementors. But the Dementors are not invincible, said Harry. He could have cast the Patronus charm with that thought, in that very moment. Never believe that they are. Professor Quirrell's voice was very quiet. Do you remember what it was like when you went before the Dementor the first time when you failed? I remember. And then with a sudden sickening lurch in his stomach, Harry knew where this was going. He should have seen it before. There is an innocent person in Azkaban, Professor Quirrell said. Harry nodded. There was a burning sensation in his throat, but he didn't cry. The one of whom I speak was not under the imperious curse, said the defense professor, dark robes silhouetted against a greater shadow. There are surer ways to break wills than the imperious, if you have the time for torture and legilimency and rituals of which I will not speak. I cannot tell you how I know this, how I know any of this, cannot hint at it even to you. You will have to trust me. But there is a person in Azkaban who never once chose to serve the Dark Lord, who has spent years suffering alone in the most terrible cold and darkness imaginable, and never deserved a single minute of it. Harry saw it in a single leap of intuition, his mouth racing almost ahead of his thoughts. There was no hint, no warning. We all thought a person by the name of Black, Harry said. There was silence. Silence, while the pale blue eyes stared at him. Well, said Professor Quirrell after a while. So much for not telling you the name until after you had accepted the mission. I would ask whether you're reading my mind, but that's flatly impossible. Harry said nothing, but it was simple enough if you believed in the processes of modern democracy. The most obvious person in Azkaban to be innocent was the one who hadn't gotten a trial. I am certainly impressed, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell. His face was grave. But this is a serious matter, and if there is some way others could make the same deduction, I must know. So tell me, Mr. Potter. How in the name of Merlin, of Atlantis, and the void between the stars, did you guess that I was talking about Bellatrix? 52. The Stamford Prison Experiment, PT2. The adrenaline was already flowing in Harry's veins, his heart already hammering in his chest, there in that darkened and bankrupt store. Professor Quirrell had finished explaining, and in one hand, Harry held a tiny wooden twig that would be the key. This was it. This was the day and the moment when Harry started acting the part. His first true adventure, a dungeon to be pierced, an evil government to be defied, a maiden in distress to be rescued. Harry should have been more frightened, more reluctant, but instead he felt only that it was time, and past time to start becoming the people he had read about in his books, to begin his journey toward what he had always known he was meant to be, a hero. To take the first step on the road that led to Kimball Kinnison and Captain Picard and Lion-O of Thunderer, and definitely not Raceland Major. So far as Harry's brain knew from watching early morning cartoons, when you grew up you were supposed to gain amazing powers and save the universe. That was what Harry's brain had seen adults doing and adopted as its role model for the maturation process, and Harry very much wanted to start growing up. And if the pattern of the story called for the hero to lose some part of his innocence as the result of his first adventure, then for now, at least, in this still innocent moment, it seemed time and past time for him to experience that pain. Like casting off clothes too small for him, or like finally advancing to the next stage of the game after being stuck for 11 years on World 3, Level 2 of Super Mario Bros. Harry had read enough novels to suspect that he wouldn't feel this enthusiastic afterward, so he was enjoying it while it lasted. There was a popping sound, something near Harry disappeared, and then there was no more time for heroic brooding. Harry's hand snapped the small wooden twig. A hook yanked motionlessly at Harry's abdomen as the portkey activated, feeling like a much harder pull this time than the smaller transports between the Hogwarts grounds and Diagon Alley, and dropped him into the middle of a huge roll of thunder dying away, and a lash of cold rain whipping him across the face, the water coating Harry's glasses and blinding him in an instant, turning the world into a blur even as he began to fall toward the raging ocean waves far below. He had arrived high above the empty North Sea. The shock of the blasting storm almost made Harry let go of the broomstick that Professor Quirrell had given him, which would not have been a good idea. It took nearly a full second for Harry to get his wits together and bring his broomstick back up in an easy swoop. "I'm here," said an unfamiliar voice from a patch of empty air above him. Low and gravelly, the voice of the sallow, lanky, bearded man Professor Quirrell had polyjuiced into before disillusioning himself and his broomstick. "I'm here," Harry said from beneath the cloak of invisibility. He hadn't used polyjuice himself. Wearing a different body hindered your magic, and Harry might need all of his little magic about him. Thus the plan called for Harry to stay invisible at nearly all times, instead of polyjuicing. Neither of them had spoken the other's name. You simply didn't use your names at any point during an illegal mission, even invisibly hovering over an anonymous patch of water in the North Sea. You simply didn't. It would be stupid. Carefully keeping a grip on the broomstick with one hand, while the rain and wind howled around him, Harry raised his wand in an equally careful grip and impervioused his glasses. Then, with the lenses clear, Harry looked around. He was surrounded by wind and rain. It might have been 5 degrees Celsius if he was lucky. He'd already had a warming charm cast on himself just from being outside in February, but it wasn't standing up to the driving, cold droplets. Worse than snow, the rain soaked into every exposed surface. The cloak of invisibility turned all of you invisible, but it didn't cover all of you, and that meant it didn't protect all of you from rain. Harry's face was exposed to the full force of the driven water, and it was driving straight into his neck and soaking down into his shirt, also the sleeves of his robes and the cuffs of his pants and his shoes. The water took every bit of cloth as an avenue to sneak in. "This way," said the polyjuiced voice, and a spark of green light lit up in front of Harry's broomstick and then darted away in a direction that seemed to Harry like every other direction. Through the blinding rain, Harry followed. He lost it sometimes, that small green spark, and each time he did, Harry called out, and the spark would reappear in front of him a few seconds later. When Harry had caught the trick of following the spark, it accelerated, and Harry kicked the broomstick into high gear and followed. The rain whipped him harder, feeling like Harry imagined it must feel to get a faceful of shotgun pellets, but his glasses stayed clear and protected his eyes. It was only a few minutes later, at the broomstick's full speed, that Harry caught a glimpse of a huge shadow through the rain, towering far across the waters, and felt a distant, hollow echo of emptiness radiating from where death waited, washing over Harry's mind and parting around it, like a wave breaking on stone. Harry knew his enemy this time, and his will was steel and all of the light. "I can already feel the Dementors," said the gravelly voice of the polyjuiced Quirrell. "I did not expect that, not this soon." "Think of the stars," Harry said, over a distant rumble of thunder. "Don't allow any anger in you, nothing negative, just think of the stars, what it feels like to forget yourself and fall bodilessly through space. Hold to that thought like an occlumency barrier across your entire mind. The Dementors will have some trouble reaching past that." There was silence for a moment then. Interesting. The green spark lifted, and Harry inclined his broomstick slightly upward to follow, even as it steered them into a fogbank, a cloud hovering low on the waters. Soon they were hovering above and slightly oblique of the huge three-sided metal building as it loomed far below. The triangle of steel was hollow, not solid. It was a building of 3 thick solid walls and no center. The auras on guard roomed in the top level and southern side of the building, Professor Quirrell had said, protected by their patroness charms. The legal entrance into Azkaban was on the roof of the southwest corner of the building, which the two of them wouldn't use, of course. Instead, they would use a corridor that ran directly beneath the northern corner of the building. Professor Quirrell would go down first and puncture a hole in the roof and its wards right at the northern tip, leaving behind an illusion to cover the gap. The prisoners were kept in the side of the building, in levels corresponding to their crimes, and at the bottom, in the uttermost center and depth of Azkaban, lay a nest of more than 100 Dementors. Loads of dirt were occasionally dropped in to keep up the level, as the matter directly exposed to the Dementors broke down into mud and nothingness. "Wait 1 minute," said the rough voice. "Follow me at speed and pass through with care." "Got it," Harry said lowly. The spark winked out, and Harry began to count 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. 61,000, and Harry dived, the wind shrieking around him as he dived, down toward the vast metal structure, down toward where he could feel the shadows of death waiting for him, draining light and radiating emptiness, as the metal structure grew larger and larger. Plain and featureless loomed the vast grey shape, but for a single raised box-like structure in the southwest corner. The north corner was simply blank, Professor Quirrell's hole undetectable. Harry pulled up sharply as he approached the north corner, giving himself more safety margin than he would have bothered with in flying classes, but not too much. As soon as he'd come to a halt, he began to slowly lower his broomstick again, toward what looked like the solid roof of the tip of the north corner. Descending through the illusory roof, while invisible, was a strange experience, and then Harry found himself in a metal corridor lighted with a dim orange light, which, Harry realized after a startled glance, was coming from an old-fashioned mantled gas lamp. For magic would fail, be drained away after a time, in the presence of Dementors. Harry dismounted his broom. The pull of the emptiness was stronger now, as it parted and flowed around Harry without touching him. They were distant, but they were many, the wounds in the world. Harry could have pointed to them with his eyes closed. "Cast your Patronus," hissed a snake from the floor, looking more discolored than green in the dim orange light. The note of stress came through even in Parseltongue. Harry was surprised. Professor Quirrell had said that animagi in their animagus forms were much less vulnerable to Dementors. For the same reason the Patronuses were animals, Harry assumed. If Professor Quirrell was in this much trouble in his snake form, what had been happening to him while he was in the human form that let him use his magic? Harry's wand was already rising in his hand. This would be the beginning. Even if it was only one person, just one person that he could save from the darkness, even if he wasn't powerful enough yet to teleport all of Azkaban's prisoners to safety and burn the triangular hell down to bedrock. Even so, it was a start. It was a beginning. It was a down payment on everything that Harry meant to accomplish with his life. No more waiting, no more hoping, no more mere promising. It would all begin here and now. Harry's wand slashed down to point at where the Dementors waited far below. Expecto Patronum. The glowing humanoid figure blazed up into existence. It wasn't the sun-bright thing that it had been before. Probably because Harry hadn't quite been able to stop himself from thinking about all the other prisoners in their cells, the ones that he wasn't here to save. It might be for the best, though. Harry would need to keep this Patronus going for a while, and it might be better if it wasn't quite so bright. The Patronus dimmed a little further at that thought, and then further again, as Harry tried to put a little less of his strength into it, until finally the brilliant humanoid figure was glowing only slightly brighter than the brightest animal Patronus, and Harry felt that he could dim it no further without risking losing it entirely. And then, "It is stable," Harry hissed, and began feeding his broomstick into his pouch. His wand stayed in his hand, and a slight, sustainable flow from him replaced the slight losses from his Patronus. The snake blurred into the form of a lanky, sallow man, holding Professor Quirrell's wand in one hand and a broomstick in the other. The lanky man staggered as he came back into existence and went to lean against the wall for a moment. "Well done, if perhaps a trifle slow," murmured the gravelly voice. Professor Quirrell's dryness was in it, even though it didn't fit the voice, nor did the grave look on the thickly bearded face. "I cannot feel them at all now." A moment later, the broomstick went into the man's robes and vanished. Then the man's wand rose and tapped on his head, and with a sound like a cracking eggshell, he disappeared once more. Within the air blossomed a faint green spark, and Harry, still enshrouded in the cloak of invisibility, followed after. If you had been watching from outside, you would have seen nothing but a small green spark drifting through the air, and a brilliantly silver humanoid walking after it. They went down, and down, and down, passing gas lamp after gas lamp, and the occasional huge metal door, descending into Azkaban within what seemed like utter silence. Professor Quirrell had set up some type of barrier by which he could hear what went on nearby, but no sounds could pass outward, and no sounds could reach Harry. Harry hadn't quite been able to stop his mind from wondering why the silence, or stop his mind from giving the answer. The answer he'd already known on some wordless level of anticipation that had prompted him to futilely try not to think about it. Somewhere behind those huge metal doors, people were screaming. The silver humanoid figure wavered, brightening and dimming every time Harry thought about it. Harry had been told to cast a bubblehead charm on himself, to prevent himself from smelling anything. All the enthusiasm and heroism had worn off already, as Harry had known it would. It hadn't taken long even by his standards. The process had completed itself the very first time they passed one of those metal doors. Every metal door was locked with a huge lock, a lock of simple, unmagical metal that wouldn't have stopped a first-year Hogwarts student. If you still had a wand, if you still had your magic, which the prisoners didn't. Those metal doors were not the doors of individual cells. Professor Quirrell had said. Each one opened into a corridor in which there would be a group of cells. Somehow that helped a little, not thinking that each door corresponded directly to a prisoner who was waiting right behind it. Instead, there might be more than one prisoner, which diminished the emotional impact. Just like the study showing that people contributed more when they were told that a given amount of money was required to save one child's life, than when told the same total amount was needed to save 8 children. Harry was finding it increasingly hard not to think about it, and every time he did, the light of his patronus fluctuated. They came to the place where the passageway turned left, at the corner of the triangular building. Once again, there were descending metal steps, another flight of stairs. Once again, they went down. Mere murderers were not put into the lowest of cells. There was always a lower place you could go, an even worse punishment to fear. No matter how low you had already sunk, the government of magical Britain had some threat remaining against you if you did even worse. But Bellatrix Black had been the Death Eater who inspired more fear than anyone save Lord Voldemort himself, a beautiful and deadly sorceress, absolutely loyal to her master. She had been, if such a thing were possible, more sadistic and evil even than you-know-who, as though she were trying to outdo her master. That was what the world knew of her, what the world believed of her. But before then, Professor Quirrell had told Harry, before the debut of the Dark Lord's most terrible servant, there had been a girl in Slytherin who had been quiet, keeping mostly to herself, harming no one. Afterward there had been made-up stories told about her, memories changing in retrospect. Harry knew well the research on that. But at the time, while she still attended school, the most talented witch in Hogwarts had been known as a gentle girl, Professor Quirrell had said. Her few friends had been surprised when she joined the Death Eaters, and more surprised that she'd been hiding so much darkness behind that sad, wistful smile. That was who Bellatrix had once been, the most promising witch of her own generation, before the Dark Lord stole her and broke her, shattered her and reshaped her, binding her to him on a deeper level and with darker arts than any Imperius. 10 years Bellatrix had served the Dark Lord, killing who he bade her kill, torturing who he bade her torture. And then the Dark Lord had finally been defeated, and Bellatrix's nightmare had continued. Somewhere inside Bellatrix there might be something that was still screaming, that had been screaming the whole time, something a psychiatric healer could bring back. Or there might not be. Professor Quirrell had no way of knowing. But either way, they could. They could at least get her out of Azkaban. Bellatrix Black had been put into the lowest level of Azkaban. Harry was having trouble not imagining what he would see when they got to her cell. Bellatrix must have had almost no fear of death, in the beginning, if she was still alive at all. They descended another flight of stairs, coming that much closer to death and Bellatrix, the clacking of their invisible shoes the only sound that Harry could hear. Dim orange light coming from the gas lights, the faint green spark drifting through the air, the shining figure following with its silver light, fluctuating from time to time. After descending many times, they came in time to a corridor that did not end in stairs, and a final metal door, and the green spark halted before it. Harry's heart had calmed a little, as they descended far into the depths of Azkaban without anything happening. But now it was hammering his chest once more. They were at the bottom, and the shadows of death were very close at hand. A soft metal click came from the lark as Professor Quirrell opened the way. Harry took a deep breath and remembered everything that Professor Quirrell had told him. The hard part wouldn't just be getting the pretended personality right enough to fool Bellatrix Black herself. The hard part would be keeping his Patronus going at the same time. The green spark winked out, and a moment later a meter-high snake shimmered into existence, no longer invisible. The metal door moved with a slow creaking sound as Harry pushed on it with his invisible hand, opened it just a crack, and peered through. He saw a straight corridor that terminated in solid stone. There was no light there but what crept in from Harry's Patronus. That was bright enough for him to see the outer bars of the 8 cells set into the corridor, but he couldn't see the insides. More importantly, though, he didn't see anyone in the corridor itself. "I see nothing," hissed Harry. The snake darted on ahead, swiftly twisting across the floor. A moment later, "She is alone," hissed the snake. "Stay," Harry thought to his Patronus, which took up a position just to one side of the door, as though guarding it. And then Harry pushed the door open further and followed within. The first cell Harry looked at contained a desiccated corpse, skin gone grey and mottled, flesh worn through in places to expose the bone beneath. No eyes. Harry shut his eyes. He could still do that. He was still invisible. He wasn't betraying anything by shutting his eyes. He'd known it already. He'd read it on page 6 of his Transfiguration book, that you stayed in Azkaban until your prison term was done. If you died before it was up, they kept you there until they released your corpse. If your term was for life, they just left the body in the cell until the cell was needed, at which point they threw your body into the Dementor's pit. But it was still a shock to see. That corpse had been a person who'd just been left there. The light in the room wavered. Steady, thought Harry in his core. It wouldn't be good for Professor Quirrell if that Patronus went out from his thinking sad thoughts. This near to the Dementors, the defense professor might just fall dead where he stood. Steady, Harry James Potter Evans Veres, steady. With that thought, Harry opened his eyes again. There wasn't time to waste. The second cell he looked at contained only a skeleton, and behind the bars of the third cell he saw Bellatrix Black. Something precious and irreplaceable inside Harry withered like dry grass. You could tell the woman wasn't a skeleton, that her head wasn't a skull, because the texture of skin was still different from the texture of bone, no matter how white and pale she'd become, waiting in the dark alone. Either they weren't feeding her much, or what she ate, the shadows of death drained from her. For her eyes seemed shrunken below their lids, her lips looked too shriveled to close over her teeth. The color seemed leached out of the black clothing she had worn into prison, like the Dementors had drained that too. They'd been meant to be daring, those clothes, and now they lay loosely over a skeleton, exposing shriveled skin. "I'm here to save her, I'm here to save her, I'm here to save her," Harry thought to himself, desperately, over and over with an effort like a clemency, willing his Patronus not to go out, to stay and protect Bellatrix from the Dementors. In his heart, in his core, Harry held to all his pity and his compassion, his will to save her from the darkness. The silver radiance coming in through the open door brightened, even as he thought it. And in another part of him, like he was just letting another part of his mind carry out a habit without paying much attention to it, a cold expression came over Harry's face, invisibly beneath the hood. "Hello, my dear Bella," said a chill whisper. "Did you miss me?" 53. The Stamford Prison Experiment, PT3. The corpse of a woman opened her eyes, and the dull, sunken orbs gazed out at nothing. "Mad," Bellatrix muttered in a cracked voice. "It seems that little Bella is going mad." Professor Quirrell had instructed Harry, calmly and precisely, how he was to act in Bellatrix's presence, how to form the pretense he would maintain in his mind. You found it expedient, or perhaps just amusing, to make Bellatrix fall in love with you, to bind her to your service. That love would have persisted through Azkaban, Professor Quirrell had said, because to Bellatrix it would not be a happy thought. She loves you utterly, completely, with her whole being. You do not return her love, but consider her useful. She knows this. She was the deadliest weapon you possessed, and you called her your dear Bella. Harry remembered it from the night the Dark Lord killed his parents. The cold amusement, the contemptuous laughter, that high-pitched voice of deathly hate. It didn't seem at all difficult to guess what the Dark Lord would say. I hope you're not mad, Bella dear, said the chill whisper. Mad is not useful. Bellatrix's eyes flickered, tried to focus on empty air. My lord, I waited for you, but you did not come. I looked for you, but I could not find you. You are alive. All her words came out in a low mutter. If there was emotion in it, Harry could not tell. Show her your face, hissed the snake at Harry's feet. Harry cast back the hood of the cloak of invisibility. The part of him that Harry had placed in control of his facial expressions looked at Bella without the slightest trace of pity, only cool, calm interest. While in his core Harry thought, I will save you no matter what. The scar, muttered Bellatrix. That child. So they all still think, said Harry's voice, and gave a thin little chuckle. You looked for me in the wrong place, Bella dear. Harry had asked why Professor Quirrell couldn't be the one to play the part of the Dark Lord, and Professor Quirrell had pointed out that there was no plausible reason for him to be possessed by the shade of he who must not be named. Bellatrix's eyes remained fixed on Harry. She said no word. Say something in parcel tongue, hissed the snake. Harry's face turned to the snake to make it clear that he was addressing it, and hissed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, S6, S7, 8, 9, 10. There was a pause. Those who do not fear the darkness, murmured Bellatrix. The snake hissed, will be consumed by it. Will be consumed by it, whispered the chill voice. Harry didn't particularly want to think about how Professor Quirrell had gotten that password. His brain, which thought about it anyway, suggested that it had probably involved a Death Eater, a quiet, isolated place, and some lead-pipe legilimency. Your wand, murmured Bellatrix. I took it from the Potter's house and hid it, my lord. Under the tombstone to the right of your father's grave. Will you kill me now if that was all you wished of me? I think I must have always wanted you to be the one to kill me. But I can't remember now. It must have been a happy thought. Harry's heart wrenched inside him. It was unbearable, and he couldn't cry, couldn't let his patroness fade. Harry's face showed a flicker of annoyance, and his voice was sharp as it said, Enough foolishness. You're to come with me, Bella dear, unless you prefer the company of the Dementors. Bellatrix's face twitched in brief puzzlement. The shrunken limbs did not stir. You'll need to float her out, Harry hissed to the snake. She can no longer think of escaping. Yes, hissed the snake, but do not underestimate her, she was the deadliest of warriors. The green head dipped in warning. One would be wished to fear me, boy, even were I starved and 9/10 dead. Be wary of her, allow no single flaw in your pretense. The green snake smoothly glided out of the door, and shortly after, a man with sallow skin and a fearful expression on his bearded face cringed into the room with his wand in hand. My lord, the servant said falteringly. Do as you were instructed, the Dark Lord whispered in that chill voice, sounding even more terrible coming from a child's body. And do not let your patroness falter. Remember, if I do not return, there will be no reward for you, and it will be long before your family is allowed to die. Having spoken those dreadful words, the Dark Lord pulled his invisibility cloak over his head and disappeared. The cringing servant opened the door to Bellatrix's cage and pulled a tiny needle from his robes with which he poked the human skeleton. The single drop of red blood produced was soon absorbed into a small doll, which was laid upon the floor, and the servant began to chant in a whisper. Soon another living skeleton lay upon the floor, motionless. Afterward, the servant seemed to hesitate for a moment, until from the empty air hissed an impatient command. Then the servant pointed his wand at Bellatrix and spoke a word, and the living skeleton lying on the bed was naked, and the skeleton lying on the floor was clothed in her faded dress. The servant tore a small strip of cloth from the dress, as it lay upon the seeming corpse, and from his own robes the fearful man then produced an empty glass flask with small traces of golden fluid clinging to its inside. This flask was concealed in a corner, the strip of skirt laid over it, the leached cloth nearly blending with the grey metal wall. Another wave of the servant's wand floated the human skeleton lying on the bed into the air, and in almost the same motion clothed her in new black robes. An ordinary-looking bottle of chocolate milk was put into her hand, and a chill whisper ordered Bellatrix to grasp the bottle and begin drinking it, which she did, her face still looking only puzzled. Then the servant turned Bellatrix invisible, and turned himself invisible, and they left. The door closed behind them all and clicked as it locked, plunging the corridor into darkness once more, unchanged but for a small flask concealed in the corner of one cell and a fresh corpse lying upon its floor. Earlier, in the deserted shop, Professor Quirrell had told Harry that they were going to commit the perfect crime. Harry had unthinkingly started to repeat back the standard proverb that there was no such thing as a perfect crime, before he actually thought about it for 2/3 of a second, remembered a wiser proverb, and shut his mouth in mid-sentence. What do you think you know, and how do you think you know it? If you did commit the perfect crime, nobody would ever find out, so how could anyone possibly know that there weren't perfect crimes? As soon as you looked at it that way, you realized that perfect crimes probably got committed all the time, and the coroner marked it down as death by natural causes, or the newspaper reported that the shop had never been very profitable and had finally gone out of business. When Bellatrix Black's corpse was found dead in her cell the next morning, they were within the prison of Azkaban from which everyone knew. No one had ever escaped. Nobody bothered doing an autopsy. Nobody thought twice about it. They just locked up the corridor and left, and the Daily Prophet reported it in the obituary column the next day. That was the perfect crime which Professor Quirrell had planned, and it wasn't Professor Quirrell who screwed it up. 54. The Stanford Prison Experiment, PT4. A faint green spark moved forward to set the pace, and behind it followed a brilliant silver figure, all other entities invisible. They had traversed 5 legs of corridor, turned right 5 times, and gone up 5 flights of stairs. And when Bellatrix had finished her second bottle of chocolate milk, she had been given solid bars of chocolate to eat. It was after her 3rd bar of chocolate that strange noises began to come from Bellatrix's throat. It took a moment for Harry to understand, to process the sounds. It didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard before. The rhythm of it was shattered, almost unrecognizable. It took him that long to realize that Bellatrix was crying. Bellatrix Black was crying. The Dark Lord's most terrible weapon was crying. She was invisible, but you could hear it, tiny, pathetic sounds she was trying to suppress, even now. "It's real," said Bellatrix. Tonality had returned into her voice, no longer a dead mutter. It rose up at the end to form the question. "It's real." Yes, thought the part of Harry simulating the Dark Lord, now be silent. He couldn't make those words pass his lips. He just couldn't. "I knew you would come to me someday." Bellatrix's voice quavered and fractured as she drew breath for quiet sobs. "I knew you were alive, that you would come to me, my lord." There was a long inhalation like a huge gasp, and that even when you came, you still wouldn't love me, never. You would never love me back, that was why. They couldn't take my love from me. Even though I can't remember so many other things, though I don't know what I forgot. But I remember how much I love you, Lord. There was a knife stabbing through Harry's heart. He'd never heard anything so terrible. He wanted to hunt down the Dark Lord and kill him just for this. "Do you still have use for me, my lord?" "No," hissed Harry's voice. Without him even thinking, it just seemed to be operating on automatic. "I entered Azkaban on a whim. Of course I have use for you. Don't ask foolish questions." "But I'm weak," said Bellatrix's voice, and a full sob escaped her. It sounded much too loud in the corridors of Azkaban. "I can't kill for you, my lord. I'm sorry, they ate it all, ate me all up. I'm too weak to fight. What good am I to you now?" Harry's brain cast about desperately for some way to reassure her, from the lips of a Dark Lord who would never speak a single word of caring. "Ugly," said Bellatrix. Her voice said that word like it was the final nail in her coffin, the last despair. "I'm ugly, they ate that too. I'm not pretty anymore. You won't even be able to use me as a reward, for your servants, even the Lestranges, won't want to hurt me anymore." The brilliant silver figure stopped walking. Because Harry had stopped walking. The Dark Lord, The part of Harry's self that was soft and vulnerable was screaming in disbelieving horror, trying to reject reality, refuse the understanding, even as a colder and harder part completed the pattern. She obeyed him in that as she obeyed him in all things. The green spark bobbed urgently, darted forward. The silver humanoid stayed in place. Bellatrix was sobbing harder. I'm not. I can't be useful anymore." Giant hands were squeezing Harry's chest, wringing him like a washcloth, trying to crush his heart. "Please," whispered Bellatrix, "just kill me." Her voice seemed to calm once she said that. "Please, Lord, kill me. I've no reason to live if I'm no use to you. I only want it to stop." Please hurt me one last time, my lord. Hurt me until I stop. I love you." It was the saddest thing Harry had ever heard. The bright silver shape of Harry's patroness flickered, wavered, brightened the fury that was rising in Harry, his rage against the Dark Lord who had done this, the rage against the Dementors, against Azkaban, against the world that allowed such horror. It all seemed to be pouring straight through his arm and into his wand without there being any way of blocking it. He tried willing it to stop, and nothing happened. "My lord," whispered the disguised voice of Professor Quirrell, "my spell is going out of control." "Help me, my lord." Brighter the patroness, brighter and brighter. It was waxing faster than on the day that Harry had destroyed a Dementor. "My lord," the silhouette said in a terrified whisper. "Help me. Everyone will feel it, my lord. Everyone will feel it," thought Harry. His imagination could picture it clearly, the prisoners in their cells stirring as the cold and darkness fell away, replaced by healing light. Every exposed surface now burned like a white sun in the reflections, the silhouette of Bellatrix's skeleton and the sallow man now clearly visible in the blaze, the disillusionment spells unable to keep pace with the unearthly brilliance. Only the cloak of invisibility out of the Deathly Hallows withstood it. "My lord, you must stop it." But Harry could no longer will it to stop. He no longer wanted it to stop. He could sense it, more and more of the sparks of life in Azkaban being sheltered by his patroness. As it unfolded like spreading wings of sunlight, the air turned to absolute silver as he thought it. Harry knew what he had to do. "Please, my lord." The words went unheard. They were far from him, the Dementors in their pit, but Harry knew that they could be destroyed even at this distance if the light blazed bright enough. He knew that death itself could not face him if he stopped holding back. So he unsealed all the gates inside him and sank the wells of his spell into all the deepest parts of his spirit, all his mind and all his will, and gave over absolutely everything to the spell. And in the interior of the sun, an only slightly dimmer shadow moved forward, reaching out an entreating hand. Wrong don't the sudden sense of doom clashed with Harry's steel determination, dread and uncertainty striving against the bright purpose. Nothing else might have reached him but that. The silhouette took another step forward and another, the sense of doom rising to a point of terrible catastrophe. And in the drench of cold water, Harry saw it. He realized the consequences of what he was doing, the danger and the trap. If you had been watching from outside, you would have seen the interior of the sun brightening and dimming, and finally fading into ordinary moonlight that seemed like pitch darkness by contrast. Within the darkness of that moonlight stood a sallow man with his hand outstretched in entreaty, and the skeleton of a woman lying upon the floor, a puzzled look upon her face. And Harry, still invisible, fallen to his knees. The greater danger had passed, and now Harry was just trying not to collapse, to keep the spell going at the lower level. He drained something, hopefully not lost something. He should have known, should have remembered, that it wasn't mere magic that fueled the patroness charm. "Thank you, my lord," whispered the sallow man. "Fool," said the hard voice of a boy pretending to be a dark lord. "Did I not warn you that the spell could prove fatal if you failed to control your emotions?" Professor Quirrell's eyes did not widen, of course. "Yes, my lord, I understand," said the Dark Lord's servant in a faltering voice, and turned to Bellatrix. She was already pushing herself off the floor slowly, like an old Muggle woman. "How funny," Bellatrix whispered. "You were almost killed by a patroness charm." A giggle that sounded like it was blowing dust out of her giggle pipes. "I could punish you, maybe, if my lord froze you in place and I had knives. Maybe I can be useful after all. Oh, I feel a little better now, how strange." "Be silent, dear Bella," Harry said in a chill voice, "until I give you leave to speak." There was no reply, which was obedience. The servant levitated the human skeleton and made her invisible once more, followed shortly by his own disappearance with the sound of another cracking egg. They passed on through the corridors of Azkaban. And Harry knew that, as they passed, the prisoners were stirring in their cells, as the fear lifted for one precious moment, maybe even feeling a small touch of healing as his light passed them by, and then collapsing down again as the cold and darkness pressed back in. Harry was trying very hard not to think about it. Otherwise, his patroness would wax until it burned away every Dementor in Azkaban. blazing bright enough to destroy them even at this distance. Otherwise, his patronus would wax until it burned away every Dementor in Azkaban, taking all of Harry's life as fuel. In the Auror's quarters at the top of Azkaban, one Auror trio was snoring in the barracks, one Auror trio was resting in the break room, and one Auror trio was on duty in the command room, keeping their watch. The command room was simple but large, with 3 chairs at back where 3 Aurors sat, their wands always in hand to sustain their 3 patronesses, as the bright white forms paced in front of the open window, sheltering them all from the Dementor's fear. The 3 of them usually stuck to the back and played poker and didn't look out the window. You could have seen some sky there, sure, and there was even an hour or 2 every day where you could have seen some sun, but that window also looked down on the central pit of hell, just in case a Dementor wanted to float up and talk to you. There was no way that Auror Lee would have agreed to serve duty here, triple pay or no triple pay, if he hadn't had a family to support. His real name was Zairagwang, and everyone called him Mike instead. He'd named his children Sue and Cow, which hopefully would serve them better. His only consolation, besides the money, was that at least his mates played an excellent game of dragon poker, though it would be hard not to at this point. It was their 5,366th game, and Lee had what would probably be his best hand of the 5,300s. It was a Saturday in February, and there were 3 players, which let him shift the suit of any one whole card except a 2, 3, or 7. And that was enough to let him build a Korakor with unicorns, dragons, and 7s. Across the table from him, Gerard McCusker looked up from the table cards toward the direction of the window, staring. The sinking feeling came over Lee's stomach with surprising speed. If his 7 of hearts got hit by a Dementor modifier and turned into a 6, he was going straight down to 2 pair, and McCusker might beat that. "Mike," said McCusker, "what's with your patronus?" Lee turned his head and looked. His soft silver badger had turned away from its watch over the pit and was staring downward at something only it could see. A moment later, Bari's moonlit duck and McCusker's bright anteater followed suit, staring in the same downward direction. They all exchanged glances and then sighed. "I'll tell them," said Bari. Protocol called for sending the 3 Aurors who were off duty but not sleeping to investigate anything anomalous. "Maybe relieve one of them and take the C spiral, if you 2 don't mind." Lee exchanged a glance with McCusker, and they both nodded. It wasn't too hard to break into Azkaban if you were wealthy enough to hire a powerful wizard and well-intentioned enough to recruit someone who could cast the Patronus charm. People with friends in Azkaban would do that, break in just to give someone a half-day's worth of Patronus time, a chance at some real dreams instead of nightmares. Leave them a supply of chocolate to conceal in their cell to increase the chance they lived through their sentence, and the Aurors on guard. Well, even if you got caught, you could probably convince the Aurors to overlook it in exchange for the right bribe. For Lee, the right bribe tended to be in the range of 2 nuts and a silver sickle. He hated this place, but Bari One Hand had a wife and the wife had healer's bills, and if you could afford to hire someone who could break into Azkaban, then you could afford to grease Bari's remaining palm pretty hard if he was the one who caught you. By unspoken agreement, none of them giving anything away by being the first to propose it, the 3 of them finished out their poker hand first. Lee won, since no Dementors had actually shown up. And by then the patronesses had stopped staring and gone back to their normal patrol, so it was probably nothing. But procedure was procedure. After Lee raked in the pot, Barry gave them all formal nods and stood up from the table. The older man's long white locks brushed against his fancy red robes. His robes brushed the metal floor of the command room as Barry went through the separating door that led to the formerly off-duty Aurors. Lee had been sorted into Hufflepuff, and he sometimes felt a little queasy about this kind of business. But Bari had shown them all the pictures, and you had to let a man do what he could for his poor sick wife, especially when he only had 7 months left before his retirement. The faint green spark floated through the metal corridors, and the silver humanoid, seeming a little dimmer now, followed after it. Sometimes the bright figure would flare, especially when they passed one of the huge metal doors, but it always died back down again. Mere eyes could not have seen the invisible others, the 11-year-old boy who lived, and the living skeleton that was Bellatrix Black, and the Polyjuice defense professor of Hogwarts, all traveling together through Azkaban. If that was the beginning of a joke, Harry didn't know the punchline. They'd gone up another 4 flights of stairs before the rough voice of the defense professor said, simply and without emphasis, "Aura coming." It took too long, a whole second maybe, for Harry to understand, for the jolt of adrenaline to pump into his blood, and for him to remember what Professor Quirrell had already discussed with him and told him to do in this case, and then Harry spun on his heel and flew back the way they'd come. Harry reached the flight of stairs and frantically laid himself down on the 3rd step from the top, the cold metal feeling hard even through his cloak and robes. Trying to move his head up to peer over the lip of the stairs showed that he couldn't see Professor Quirrell, and that meant that Harry was out of the line of any stray fire. His shining patroness followed after him and lay down beside him on the step just beneath him, for it too must not be seen. There was a faint sound as of wind or whooshing, and then the sound of Bellatrix's invisible body coming to rest on a stair further below. She had no place in this except, "Stay still," said the cold high whisper. "Stay silent." There was stillness and silence. Harry pressed his wand against the side of the metal step just above him. If he was anyone else, he would have needed to take a nut out of his pocket, or rip off a bit of cloth from his robe, or bite off one of his nails, or find a speck of rock large enough that he could see it, and solid enough to stay in one place in orientation while it touched his wand. But with Harry's almighty power of partial transfiguration, this was not necessary. He could skip that particular step of the operation and use any material near to hand. 30 seconds later, Harry was the proud new owner of a curved mirror, and Wingardium Leviosa, Harry whispered as quietly as he could, was levitating it just above the steps, and watching, in that curved surface, almost the whole corridor where Professor Quirrell invisibly waited. Harry heard it in the distance, then the sound of footsteps, and saw the form, a little hard to see in the mirror, of a person in red robes, coming down the stairs, entering the seemingly empty corridor, accompanied by a small patronus animal that Harry couldn't quite make out. The aura was protected by a blue shimmer. It was hard to see the details, but Harry could see that much. The aura had shields already raised and strengthened. Crap, thought Harry. According to the defense professor, the essential art of dueling consisted of trying to put up defenses that would block whatever someone was likely to throw at you, while trying in turn to attack in ways that were likely to go past their current set of defenses. And by far the easiest way to win any sort of real fight, Professor Quirrell had said this over and over, was to shoot the enemy before they raised a shield in the first place, either from behind or from close enough range that they couldn't dodge or counter in time. Though Professor Quirrell might still be able to get in a shot from behind, if but the aura halted after taking 3 steps into the corridor. "Nice disillusionment," said a hard male voice that Harry didn't recognize. "Now show yourself, or you'll be in real trouble." The form of the sallow, bearded man became visible then. "And you with the patroness," said the hard voice. "Come out too, now." "Wouldn't be smart," said the gravelly voice of the sallow man. It was no longer the terrified voice of the Dark Lord's servant. It had suddenly become the professional intimidation of a competent criminal. "You don't want to see who's behind me. Trust me, you don't. 500 galleons, cold cash up front if you turn around and walk away. Big trouble for your career if you don't." There was a long pause. "Look, whoever you are," said the hard voice. "You seem confused about how this works. I don't care if that's Lucius Malfoy behind you or Albus Bloody Dumbledore. You all come out, I scan the whole lot of you, and then we talk about how much this is going to cost you. 2,000 galleons, final offer," said the gravelly voice, taking on a warning undertone. "That's 10 times the going rate and more than you make in a year. And believe me, if you see something you shouldn't, you're going to regret not taking that." "Shut it," said the hard voice. "You've got exactly 5 seconds to drop that wand before I drop you. 5, 4. What are you doing, Professor Quirrell?" Harry thought frantically. "Attack first. Cast a shield at least." 3, 2, 1. Stupefy. Barry stared, a chill running down his spine. The man's wand had moved so fast that it was like it had apparated into place, and Barry's stunner was currently sparkling tamely at the end of it, not blocked, not countered, not deflected, caught like a fly in honey. "My offer has gone back down to 500 galleons," said the man in a colder, more formal voice. He smiled dryly, and the smile looked wrong on that bearded face. "And you shall need to accept a memory charm." Barry had already swapped the harmonics on his shields so that his own stunner couldn't pass back through, already tilted his wand back into a defensive position, already raised his hardened artificial hand into position to block anything blockable, and was already thinking wordless spells to put more layers on his shields. The man wasn't looking at Barry. Instead, he was poking curiously at Barry's stunner, where it still wavered on the end of his wand, drawing out red sparks and flicking them away with his fingers, slowly disassembling the hex like a child's rod puzzle. The man hadn't raised any shields of his own. "Tell me," the man said in a disinterested voice that didn't seem to quite fit the rough throat polyjuice Barry would have called it if he'd thought that anyone could possibly do magic that delicate from inside someone else's body. "What did you do in the last war? Put yourself in harm's way or stay out of trouble?" "Harm's way," said Barry. His voice kept the iron calm of an aura with nearly 100 full years on the force, 7 months short of mandatory retirement. Mad-Eye Moody couldn't have said it with any more hardness. "Fight any Death Eaters." Now a grim smile graced Barry's own face. "Two at once. Two of you-know-who's own warrior assassins, personally trained by their Dark Master. Two Death Eaters at once against Barry alone." It had been the toughest fight of Barry's life, but he'd stood his ground and walked away with only the loss of his left hand. "Did you kill them?" The man sounded idly curious, and he continued to draw threads of fire out of the much-diminished, stumbled, still captive on the end of his wand, his fingers now weaving small patterns of Barry's own magic before flicking to disperse them. Sweat broke out on Barry's skin beneath his robes. His metal hand flashed downward, ripped the mirror from his belt. "Barry to Mike, I need backup." There was a pause and silence. "Barry to Mike." The mirror lay dull and lifeless in his hand. Slowly, Barry put it back on his belt. "It's been quite a while since I had a serious fight with a serious opponent," the man said, still not looking up at Barry. "Try not to disappoint me too much. You can attack whenever you're ready, or you can walk away with 500 galleons." There was a long silence. Then the air screamed like metal cutting glass as Barry slashed his wand downward. Harry could hardly see it, could hardly make out anything amid the lights and flashes. His mirror's curve was perfect. They'd practiced that tactic before in the Chaos Legion. But the scene was still too small, and Harry had the feeling he wouldn't be able to understand even if he was watching from a meter away. It was all happening too fast, red blasts deflecting from blue shields, green bars of light clashing together, shadowy forms appearing and vanishing. He couldn't even tell who was casting what, except that the aura was shouting incantation after incantation and frantically dodging, while Professor Quirrell's polyjuiced form stood in one place and flicked his wand, mostly silently, but now and then pronouncing words in unrecognizable languages that would white out the whole mirror and show half the aura's shielding torn away as he staggered back. Harry had seen exhibition duels between the strongest seventh-year students, and this was so far above it that Harry's mind felt numbed, looking at how far he had left to go. There wasn't a single seventh-year student who could have lasted half a minute against the aura. All three seventh-year armies put together might not be able to scratch the defense professor. Aura had fallen to the ground, one knee and one hand supporting himself as the other hand gestured frantically, and his mouth shouted desperate words. The few incantations that Harry recognized were all shield spells, as a flock of shadows spun around the aura like a whirlwind of razors, and Harry saw Professor Quirrell's polyjuiced form deliberately point his wand at where the aura kneeled and fought the last moments of his battle. "Surrender," said the gravelly voice. The aura spat something unspeakable. "In that case," said the voice. Avada time seemed to move very slowly, like there was time to hear the individual syllables, ki and da and vra, time to watch the aura starting to throw himself desperately aside. And even though it was all happening so slowly, somehow there wasn't time to do anything. No time for Harry to open his lips and scream no, no time to move, maybe even not any time to think. Only time for one desperate wish that an innocent man should not die, and a blazing silver figure stood before the aura. Stood there just a fraction of a second before the green light struck home. Barry was twisting frantically aside, not knowing if he was going to make it. His eyes were focused on his opponent and his onrushing death, so Barry only briefly saw the outline of the brilliant silhouette, the Patronus brighter than any he'd ever seen, saw it just barely long enough to recognize the impassable shape, before the green and the silver light collided and both lights vanished. Both lights vanished. The killing curse had been blocked, and then Barry's ears were pierced as he saw his terrible opponent screaming. Screaming, clutching at his head and screaming, starting to fall as Barry was already falling. Barry hit the ground, falling from his own frantic lunge, and his dislocated left shoulder and broken ribs screamed in protest. Barry ignored the pain, managed to scramble back to his knees, brought up his wand to stun his opponent. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that this was his only chance. Stupefy. The red bolt struck out toward the man's falling body and was torn apart in midair and dissipated, and not by any shield. Barry could see it, the wavering in the air that surrounded his fallen and screaming opponent. Barry could feel it like a deadly pressure on his skin, the flux of magic building and building and building toward some terrible breaking point. His instincts screamed at him to run before the explosion came. This was no charm, no curse. This was wizardry run wild. But before Barry could even finish getting to his feet, the man threw his wand away from himself. He threw away his wand. And a second later, his form blurred and vanished entirely. A green snake lay motionless on the ground, unmoving even before Barry's next stunner spell, fired in sheer reflex, hit it without resistance. As the dreadful flux and pressure began to dissipate, as the wild wizardry died back down, Barry's dazed mind noticed that the scream was continuing. Only it sounded different, like the scream of a young boy, coming from the stairs leading down to the next lower level. That scream choked off too, and then there was silence except for Barry's frantic panting. His thoughts were slow, confused, disarrayed. His opponent had been insanely powerful. That hadn't been a duel. It had been like his first year as a trainee aura trying to fight Madame Tama. The Death Eaters hadn't been a tenth that good. Mad-Eye Moody wasn't that good. And who? What? How in the name of Merlin's balls had anyone blocked a killing curse? Barry managed to summon the energy to press his wand against his rib, mutter the healing spell, and then press it again to his shoulder. It took more out of him than it should have, took far too much out of him. His magic was within a bare breath of utter exhaustion. He didn't have anything left for his minor cuts and bruises, or even to reinforce the scraps left of his shielding. It was all he could do not to let his Patronus go out. Barry breathed deeply, heavily, steadied his breath as much as he could before he spoke. "You," Barry said, "whoever you are, come out." There was silence, and it occurred to Barry that whoever it was might be unconscious. He didn't understand what had just happened, but he'd heard the scream. Well, there was one way to test that. "Come out," said Barry, making his voice harder, "or I start using area effect curses." He probably couldn't have managed one if he'd tried. "Wait," said a boy's voice, a young boy's voice, high and thin and wavering, like someone was holding back exhaustion or tears. The voice now seemed to be coming from closer to hand. "Please wait. I'm coming out. Drop the invisibility," growled Barry. He was too tired to bother with anti-disillusionment charms. A moment later, a young boy's face emerged from within an unfolding invisibility cloak, and Barry saw the black hair, the green eyes, the glasses, and the angry red lightning bolt scar. If he'd had 20 fewer years of experience under his belt, he might have blinked. Instead, he just spat something that he probably shouldn't ought to say in front of the boy who lived. He, the boy's wavering voice said. His young face looked frightened and exhausted, and tears were still trickling down his cheeks. "He kidnapped me to make me cast my Patronus. He said he'd kill me if I didn't. Only I couldn't let him just kill you." Barry's mind was still dazed, but things were slowly starting to click into place. Harry Potter, the only wizard ever to survive a killing curse. Barry might have been able to dodge the green death. He'd certainly been trying, but if the matter came up before the Wisengamot, they'd rule it was a life debt to a noble house. "I see," Barry said in a much gentler growl. He started to walk toward the boy. "Son, I'm sorry for what you've been through, but I need you to drop the cloak and drop your wand." The rest of Harry Potter emerged from invisibility, showing the sweat-soaked blue-trimmed Hogwarts robes, and his right hand clutching an 11-inch holly wand so hard his knuckles were white. "Your wand," Barry repeated. "Sorry," whispered the 11-year-old boy. "Here." and he held out the wand toward Barry. Barry barely stopped himself from snarling at the traumatized boy who just saved his life. Instead, he overrode the impulse with a sigh and just stretched out a hand to take the wand. "Look, son, you're really not supposed to point a wand at." The wand's end twisted lightly beneath Barry's hand, just as the boy whispered, "Somnium." Harry stared at the aura's crumpled body. There was no sense of triumph, just a crushing sense of despair. Even then, it might not have been too late. Harry turned to look at where the green snake lay motionless. "Teacher," hissed Harry. "Friend, please, are you alive?" An awful fear was taking hold in Harry's heart. In that moment, he had entirely forgotten that he'd just seen the defense professor try to kill a police officer. Harry pointed his wand at the snake, and his lips even began to shape the word innervate, before his brain caught up with him and screamed at him. He didn't dare use magic on Professor Quirrell. Harry had felt it, the burning, tearing pain in his head, like his brain was about to split in half. He'd felt it, his magic and Professor Quirrell's magic, matched and anti-harmonized in a fulfillment of doom. That was the mysterious, terrible thing that would happen if Harry and Professor Quirrell ever got too close to each other, or if they ever cast magic on each other, or if their spells ever touched. The magic would resonate out of control. Harry stared at the snake. He couldn't tell if it was breathing. The last seconds ticked away. He turned to stare at the aura, who had seen the boy who lived, who knew. The full magnitude of the disaster crushed in on Harry like 1,000 hundred-ton weights. He'd managed to stun the aura, but now there was nothing left to do, no way to recover. The mission had failed. Everything had failed. He had failed. Shocked, dismayed, despairing, he didn't think of it, didn't see the obvious, didn't remember where the hopeless feelings were coming from, didn't realize that he still needed to recast the true Patronus charm. And then it was already too late. Aura Lee and Aura McCusker had rearranged their chairs around the table, and so they both saw it at the same time, the naked, skeletally thin horror rising up to hover outside the window, the headache already hitting them from seeing it. They both heard the voice, like a long-dead corpse had spoken words, and those words themselves had aged and died. The Dementor's speech hurt their ears as it said, "Bellatrix Black is out of her cell." There was a split second of horrified silence, and then Lee tore out of his chair, heading for the communicator to call in reinforcements from the ministry, even as McCusker grabbed his mirror and started frantically trying to raise the three auras who'd gone on patrol. 55. The Stanford Prison Experiment, PT-5. In a scarred and ruined corridor, lit by dim gaslights, a boy slowly crept forward, one hand stretched out, toward the unmoving snake that was the body of his teacher. Harry was only a meter away from the snake's body when he first felt it, tickling at the edge of his perception. Ever so weakly, a sense of doom. Professor Quirrell was alive then. The thought engendered no feeling of joy, only a sort of empty despair. Harry would still be caught soon, and no matter how he tried to explain, it still wouldn't look good. No one would trust him again. They would think he was the next Dark Lord. They wouldn't help him when it came time to fight Lord Voldemort. Hermione would give up on him. Probably even Dumbledore would look for another hero. Maybe they'd just send him home to his parents. He had failed. Harry looked at the crumpled body of the police officer he'd stunned, the already drying blood from the minor cuts and slashes, the burned places on the intricately embroidered red robes. He'd been stupid. He shouldn't have stunned the police officer, should have just stayed with his original story about being kidnapped by Professor Quirrell. "It might not be too late," whispered a voice inside him. "You might still be able to fix your mistake. The aura saw you. He remembers that you stunned him." If he were dead, if Professor Quirrell were dead, if Bellatrix were dead, there would be no one to contradict your story. Slowly, Harry's hand started to rise, pointing his wand at the police officer, and Harry's hand halted. He had a distant sense he was behaving uncharacteristically of himself somehow. Like there was something he'd forgotten, something important, but he was having trouble remembering what it was exactly. Oh, that was right. He was someone who believed in the value of human life. A sense of puzzlement accompanied the thought. He couldn't quite remember why other people's lives had seemed valuable. "All right," said the logical part of him. High has my mind changed between then and now, because he was in Azkaban, and he'd forgotten to recast the Patronus charm. Doing anything at all somehow seemed like a tremendous effort, like the thought of action itself was a weight too heavy to lift. But it did seem like a good idea to recast the Patronus charm, for he was still able to be afraid of Dementors. And though he couldn't remember what it was like to be happy, he knew that this wasn't it. Harry's hand rose to hold his wand level before him. His fingers took the starting positions. And then Harry paused. He couldn't quite remember what he'd used as his happy thought. That was odd. It had been something very important. He really ought to be able to remember it. Something to do with death. But that wasn't happy. His body was shivering. Azkaban hadn't seemed so cold before, and it seemed to be getting colder even as he thought. It was too late for him. He'd already sunk too far. He'd never be able to cast the Patronus charm now. That may be the dementation talking rather than an accurate estimate, observed the logical part of himself. Habits that had been encoded into sheer reflex, requiring no energy to activate. Think of the Dementor's fear as a cognitive bias, and try to overcome it the way you would overcome any other cognitive bias. Your hopeless feelings may not indicate that the situation is actually hopeless. It may only indicate that you are in the presence of Dementors. All negative emotions and pessimistic estimates must now be considered suspect, fallacious until proven valid. If you'd been watching the boy as he thought, you would have seen a distant, abstract, puzzled frown move across his face, below the glasses and the lightning bolt scar. His hand stayed in the starting position for the Patronus charm and did not move. The presence of Dementors interferes with the part of you that processes happiness. If you cannot retrieve your happy thought by mnemonic association on the key of happiness, perhaps you can get at the memory some other way instead. When was the last time you talked to someone about the Patronus charm? Harry couldn't seem to remember that either. A crushing wave of despair swept over him and was dismissed by the logical part of himself as untrustworthy, external, not Harry. The dull weight still pressed him down, but his mind went on thinking. It didn't take much effort to think. When was the last time you talked to someone about Dementors? Professor Quirrell had said that he was already able to feel the presence of Dementors, and Harry had said to Professor Quirrell. He'd told Professor Quirrell to hold to the memory of the stars, of falling bodilessly through space, like an occlumency barrier across his entire mind. His second defense class of the year, on Friday, that was when Professor Quirrell had shown him the stars, and again on Christmas. It didn't take much effort to remember them, the searing points of white against perfect blackness. Harry remembered the great cloudy wash of the Milky Way. Harry remembered the peace. Some of the coldness at the fringes of his limbs seemed to retreat. There were words he had spoken out loud on the day he'd first cast the Patronus charm. His mind could remember the sounds, and the speech, even as the feelings seemed distant. I thought of my absolute rejection of death as the natural order. You cast the true Patronus charm by thinking about the value of human life. But there are other lives that are still alive to be fought for. Your life, and my life, and Hermione Granger's life, all the lives of Earth and all the lives beyond, to be defended and protected. Then the idea of killing everyone. That hadn't been his true self, that had been the dementation talking. Despair was the Dementor's influence. Where there's life, there's hope. The Auror is still alive. Professor Quirrell is still alive. Bellatrix is still alive. I'm still alive. No one's actually died yet. Harry could picture the Earth now in the midst of the starfield, the blue-white orb. And I won't let them. Expecto Patronum. The words came out a little halting, and when the human shape burst back into existence, it was dim at first, moonlight instead of sunlight, white instead of silver. But it strengthened slowly as Harry breathed in deliberate rhythm, recovering, letting the light drive back the darkness from his mind, remembering the things that he had almost forgotten and channeling them back into the Patronus charm. Even when the light blazed full and silver once more, illuminating the corridor more brightly than the gas lamps, banishing fully the cold, Harry's limbs still shook. That had been too close. Harry took a deep breath. All right. It was time to reconsider the situation now that his thoughts were no longer being artificially darkened by Dementors. Harry reviewed the situation. Still looked pretty hopeless, actually. It wasn't the crushing despair of before, but Harry still felt wobbly, to put it mildly. He didn't dare go dark, and it was his dark side that had the ability to take this level of problem in stride. It was his dark side that would have laughed scornfully at the very concept of giving up just because he'd lost Professor Quirrell and was marooned in the depths of Azkaban and had been seen by a police officer. The ordinary Harry was not able to take that sort of thing in stride. But there wasn't any option except to keep moving forward anyway. You couldn't get any more pointless than giving up before you'd actually lost. Harry looked around. Dim gas lights lit a corridor of grey metal, whose sides and floor and ceiling were slashed in places, gouged and melted, telling anyone who cared to look that there had been battle here. Professor Quirrell could have repaired it easily enough if he'd. The sense of betrayal struck Harry with full force then. Why? Why did he? Why? Because he's evil, said Gryffindor and Hufflepuff quietly and sadly. We told you so. No, thought Harry desperately. No, it doesn't make sense. We were going to commit the perfect crime. The aura could have been obliviated, the corridor repaired. It wasn't too late, but it would have been too late if he died. But Professor Quirrell was never really planning to commit the perfect crime, said the grim voice of Slytherin. He wanted the crime to be noticed. He wanted everyone to know that someone had killed an Auror and broken Bellatrix Black out of Azkaban. He would have prepared some kind of evidence, some proof he could reveal of your involvement to use as blackmail against you, and you would have been bound to him forever. Harry's patronus almost went out then. No, Harry thought. Yes, said the other 3 parts of him sadly. No, it still doesn't make sense. Professor Quirrell had to know I would turn against him the instant I saw him kill an Auror, that I might very well go ahead and confess to Dumbledore, hoping to plead the true fact that I was tricked. And, in terms of blackmail, does his killing an Auror against my will really add all that much to breaking Bellatrix out of Azkaban with my willing help? It would have been more cunning to keep the evidence of my involvement with the basic crime, but still pretend to be my ally for as long as he could, saving the blackmail to use only if it became necessary. Rationalization, said Slytherin. So why did Professor Quirrell do it then? And Harry thought with a tinge of desperation, knowing, even as he thought it, that he was motivated in part by a desire to reject reality, and that wasn't how the technique was meant to be wielded. I notice that I am confused. There was internal silence. None of the parts of himself seemed to have anything to add to that, and Harry continued to take stock of the moderately hopeless-looking situation. Did Harry need to reevaluate the probability that Bellatrix was evil? Not in any mission-relevant sense. It was a given that Bellatrix was currently evil. Whether she was an innocent who'd been made that way by torture and legilimency and unspeakable rituals, or whether she'd chosen it of her own will, didn't have much bearing on the current situation. The key fact was that while Bellatrix thought Harry was the Dark Lord, she would obey him. That was one resource then. But Bellatrix was starved, and 9/10 dead. Oh, I feel a little better now. How strange. Bellatrix had said that, in her shattered voice, after Harry's patronus had blazed out of control. Harry thought, and he couldn't have quite said why he thought this. It might have just been his own mind making things up, but it seemed likely that what the Dementors had taken from you long ago was lost forever. But what the Dementors had taken from you recently, the true patronus charm might give back, like the difference between emptying a cup and the unused cup fading away. Bellatrix, then, might have got back what she'd lost in just the last week or so. Not any happy memories, those would have been eaten years ago. But whatever strength and magic had been drained from her in just the last week, she might have regained, like the equivalent of getting a week of rest, a week to build up her magic again. Harry looked at Professor Quirrell's snake form. Maybe enough for an innervate, if awakening Professor Quirrell was, in fact, a smart thing to do. Some of the despair came back to Harry then. He couldn't trust Professor Quirrell, couldn't trust that reviving him would be wise, not after what had just happened. Steady, Harry thought to himself, and looked at the crumpled form of the aura. Bellatrix might also be able to manage a memory charm. That could be step 1 anyway. It wasn't exactly getting everyone safely out of Azkaban, and the Aurors would know afterward that something strange had happened. They might suspect Bellatrix's body and perform an autopsy. But it was a step. And would it be all that hard to get out of Azkaban? If they could get to the top of Azkaban quickly enough, before the Auror was supposed to report back in, before anyone noticed him missing, then they could just fly out through the hole Professor Quirrell had made, and get far enough away from Azkaban to activate the portkey Harry already had in his possession. Both Professor Quirrell and Harry had portkeys, and both were powerful enough to transport 2 humans, plus or minus a snake. As with their doubly concealed departure from Mary's room, Professor Quirrell had put enough safety margin in his plans to impress even Harry. Bellatrix could carry Professor Quirrell's snake form, which Harry dared not touch or levitate. Harry turned and strode quickly toward where Bellatrix was waiting on the stairs. He could feel his spirits reviving a little. It was starting to look like a good plan, and there was no time to waste in going about it. What to do with Professor Quirrell, or for that matter Bellatrix, after the portkey took them to where they were supposed to hand Bellatrix over to the psychiatric healer? Well, Harry could work that out along the way. Harry would probably have to bamboozle the healer into doing something, which was going to take one hell of a bamboozling, and Harry wasn't even sure what he wanted done. But he and Bellatrix had to get moving now. The main problem Harry saw, as he quickly ran the whole process forward in his imagination, would come when they reached the roof. Professor Quirrell had been supposed to sneak around invisibly and confund the monitors that would notice visitors in the aerial surroundings of Azkaban, causing them to see a repeating loop of scenery for a few minutes. Professor Quirrell had said that he couldn't disillusion Harry's Patronus, and if they switched off the Patronus, the Dementors would notice Bellatrix was missing and alert the Auras. Harry's train of thought stumbled. There were times when crap just didn't seem to cover it. Lee's hands were sure despite the adrenaline as he unlocked the bars on the vanishing cabinet that linked Azkaban to a well-guarded room in the interior of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. A one-way vanishing cabinet, of course. The wards permitted a few fast ways into Azkaban, all of them highly restricted, and no fast ways out. Lee stepped well back, pointed his wand at the cabinet, spoke the incantation Harmonia Nectar Passus, and not a second later, the door of the cabinet burst open with a bang, and into the room strode a heavy-set, square-jawed witch with grayed hair cropped close around her head. She wore no rank signs, she wore no jewelry or other ornamentation. It was only an ordinary Aura's robes that she deemed fit to grace herself. Director Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and said to be the only witch in the DMLE who could take Mad-Eye Moody in a fair fight. Not that either of those two were the sort to fight fairly. Lee had heard rumors that Amelia could apparate within the bounds of the DMLE, and this was the sort of thing that gave rise to rumors like that. He'd called in the alarm not 50 seconds ago. Get into the air now. Amelia barked over her shoulder at the female Aura trio, following behind her with police broomsticks. They must have all been crushed in there, waiting for Lee to activate the cabinet. I want more aerial coverage on this place, and make sure you keep up your anti-disillusionment charms. Then her head turned toward him. Report, Aura lie. Do we know how they got in yet? Another Aura trio holding broomsticks materialized in the vanishing cabinet and strode out after them even as Lee began talking. They were followed by a trio of hit wizards in full battle gear, then another trio of hit wizards, then another broomstick team. The emaciated form that was Bellatrix Black was resting motionless on the stairs when Harry got there, eyes closed, and when Harry asked in a cold, high whisper whether she was awake, he got no response. A brief twitch of panic was countered by the thought that Professor Quirrell had knocked her out to prevent her from hearing the Dark Lord's cringing servant suddenly turn into a hardened criminal and then an expert battle mage. Which was good, because she wouldn't have heard Harry's voice saying Expecto Patronum. Harry drew back the hood of the cloak, pointed his wand at Bellatrix, and whispered as gently as he could, Innervate. From the way Bellatrix's body jerked a little, Harry didn't think he'd managed to get it quite gentle enough. The sunken dark eyes opened. Bella dear, Harry said in his cold, high voice, I am afraid we've run into a bit of a problem. Have you recovered enough to do small magics? There was a pause, and then Bellatrix's pale head nodded. Very good, Harry said dryly. I won't ask you to walk unaided, Bella dear, but I am afraid you must walk. He pointed his wand at her. Wingardium Leviosa. Harry kept the flow of force down to something he could sustain for a while, and it was still probably lifting 2/3 of her current body weight. She was thin. Slowly, as though for the first time in years, Bellatrix Black pushed herself to her feet. Amelia strode into the duty room, Aura Lee and his silver badger following behind her. She'd spun her time-turner the moment she'd heard the alarm, and then spent a tense hour preparing her forces for entry. You couldn't loop time within Azkaban itself. Azkaban's future couldn't interact with its past, so she hadn't been able to arrive before the DMLE had gotten the message, but she should have arrived in time. Her eyes went straight to the corpse, uncloaked and looking very dead, floating beyond the viewing window. "Where is Bellatrix Black?" Amelia demanded, showing no fear before the creature of fear. Even her own blood froze for an instant as the corpse parted its lips and gurgled, "Do not know." Harry watched, now fully invisible once more, as Bellatrix slowly leaned down, took Professor Quirrell's wand, which Harry dared not touch, and slowly straightened again. Then Bellatrix pointed the wand at the snake and said, her voice precise though it was still a whisper, innervate. The snake did not stir. "Shall I try again, my lord?" she whispered. "No," Harry said. He swallowed the sick feeling. Harry had decided to say the hell with it and try to revive Professor Quirrell after he'd realized that the Dementors had probably alerted the Auras by now. His high, cold voice went on, unperturbed. "Do you think you are able to perform a memory charm, dear Bella?" Bellatrix paused and then said hesitantly, "I think so, my lord." "Eliminate that Aura's last half-hour of memory," Harry commanded. He'd thought a bit about whether he wanted to provide any justification for that, what he would say if Bellatrix asked why they weren't just killing him, in which case Harry would explain that they were pretending to be a different power group and then tell her to shut up, but Bellatrix simply pointed her wand at the aura, stood silently for a time, and finally whispered, "Obliviate." She swayed then, but did not fall. "Very good, my dear Bella," Harry said, and chuckled thinly. "And I will ask you to carry that snake." Again, the woman said nothing, demanded no explanations, didn't ask why Harry or the apparently invisible Patronus Castor couldn't do it. She only staggered to where the long snake lay, slowly bent over, picked it up, draped it over her shoulder. A tiny little part of Harry observed that it was very relaxing to have a minion that would just follow orders so unquestioningly, and even got as far as thinking that he could totally get used to having a minion like Bellatrix, before that mind fraction was screamed into silence by his mortally offended remainder. "Follow," the boy commanded his minion, and began to walk. It was starting to get crowded in the duty room, almost too crowded to breathe, though there was still space around Amelia herself. If needing to breathe meant that you had to crowd Director Bones, it was better not to breathe. Amelia looked at where Aura was fiddling with Aura McCusker's mirror. "Specialist Weinbach," she barked, causing the young witch to start. "Any response from One Hand's mirror?" "None," Aura said nervously. I mean it has to be jammed, not dead, carefully jammed because it didn't set off the alarms, but the line is so blank the mirror might as well be broken." Amelia didn't let her expression change, though the part of her that was already mourning One Hand got a little sadder and a lot more angry. 7 months. He'd had 7 months left until his retirement after a full century of service. She remembered him as an eager young Aura, so very long ago, and his whole career he'd served the DMLE with perfect loyalty, at least when it came to anything really important. Someone would burn for this. The Dementor still hovered outside the window, casting its useless shadow of dread over their operations. All the creature could do was gurgle its lack of knowledge or fail to reply at all when asked questions like, "Did Bellatrix Black escape?" And "Why can't you find her?" And "How is she being hidden?" Amelia was starting to worry that the criminals were already gone when "We found a hole in the roof over C Spiral," someone shouted from the doorway. "Still open, ward circumvention still active." Amelia's lips peeled back in a smile like a wolf opening its jaws to eat. Bellatrix Black was still in Azkaban, and in Azkaban, Bellatrix Black would remain forever. She took a stride toward the window, ignoring the Dementor now, and looked up at the sky above, to check with her own eyes the patrolling broomsticks. She couldn't see the whole sky from here, but she saw 10 brooms go past on a patrol pattern, and that already ought to be enough to catch anyone, though she fully meant to put every broom she could in the air. Her auras were equipped with the fastest racing broom currently on the market, the Nimbus 2000. No unsuccessful chases for her people. Amelia turned back from the window and frowned. The room was getting ridiculously crowded, and 2/3 of these people didn't need to be here. They just wanted to be close to the center of the action. If there was one thing Amelia couldn't tolerate, it was people who did what they wanted instead of what was needed. "All right, you lot," Amelia bellowed at them. "Stop hanging around here and start securing the top level of each spiral. That's right, she said to the looks of surprise. All three. They could tunnel through a floor or a ceiling to go between them, in case you hadn't worked that out. We're going down level by level until we catch them. I'll take C Spiral, Scrimgeour, you're on B. She paused then, remembering that Mad-Eye had retired last year. Who could she? Shacklebolt, you're on the Spiral. Take with the strongest other fighters. Check every set of cells you pass, look under blankets, do the full set of detection charms in every corridor. Nobody leaves Azkaban until the criminals are caught, nobody, and people looked at Amelia in surprise as her voice trailed off. The criminals had invented some way to prevent the Dementors from finding Bellatrix Black. That ought to have been impossible. It chilled her blood, contemplating that. It was like. Amelia took a deep breath and spoke once more in a voice of steel command. And when you catch them, make bloody sure they're the real criminals and not our own people forced to take Polyjuice. Anyone behaves oddly, check them for the Imperious Curse. Keep each other in sight at all times. Don't assume an aura uniform is friendly if you don't recognize the face. She turned to the communications specialist. Tell the broomsticks. If one of the brooms peels off for no reason, half of them are to hunt it down while the rest keep patrolling. And change the harmonics on everything changeable. They may have stolen our keys. Then back to the rest of the room. No aura is above suspicion unless they have no family left to threaten. She saw it, the cold looks that came over the older faces, saw some of the younger auras flinch, and knew that they understood. But she said it out loud, just to be sure. We're fighting the old wizarding war today, everyone. Just because you know who is dead doesn't mean the Death Eaters have forgotten his tricks. Now go. Harry walked in silence through the gaslit grey corridor, invisible beside Bellatrix and the silver shape following them, trying to think of a better plan. At first, when he'd realized that the auras probably knew already, and that, moreover, Professor Quirrell wasn't waking up, his thoughts had frozen up there for a second, and then stayed frozen, even as he got himself and Bellatrix heading downward to buy as much time as possible. The auras, Harry figured, would start at the top and move down level by level. The auras could afford to move slowly and securely. They knew their prey had no way out. Harry hadn't been able to think of any way out, until Harry had said to himself, well, if it was just a war game, what would General Chaos do? From which an answer had followed instantly. And then Harry had thought, but if it's that easy, why hasn't anyone broken out of Azkaban before? And after he'd realized the possible problem, fine, what would General Chaos do about that? Whereupon General Chaos had come up with an amendment to his first plan. It was the most insanely Gryffindor thing Harry had ever. So now he was trying to think of a better plan and not having much luck. Picky, 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 said Gryffindor, who was complaining about not having any plan 1 minute earlier. You should be glad we came up with anything at all, Mr. Now We're Doomed. My lord, Bellatrix whispered haltingly as she navigated the next flight of stairs downward. Am I going back to my cell, my lord? Harry's brain was distracted, so it took him that long to process the words, and then another moment to process the horror, while Bellatrix continued speaking. I would. Please, my lord, I would very much rather die, her voice said. And then in a smaller voice, a whisper that was barely there, but I will go back if you ask it of me, my lord. We are not going back to your cell, hissed Harry's voice on automatic. Nothing of what he felt was allowed to reach his face. Said Hufflepuff. Did you seriously just think you ought to work for me? I would appreciate you. A stone would respond to that kind of loyalty, Harry thought. Even if I'm only getting it by mistake, I can't help but she's the Dark Lord's loyal killer and torturer, and the supposed reason she's loyal is because an innocent girl was broken into pieces and used as raw material to make her, said Hufflepuff. Did you forget? If someone shows me that much loyalty, even by mistake, there's a part of me that can't help but feel something. The Dark Lord must have been. Evil doesn't seem like a strong enough word. He must have been empty. To not appreciate her loyalty, artificial or not. The better parts of Harry didn't have much to say to that, and that was when Harry heard it. It was faint, and it grew louder with every step they took forward. A woman's voice, distant, indistinct. His ears automatically strained to make out the words. Please don't. Didn't mean. Don't die. Then his brain knew who he was hearing, and in almost the same moment figured out what he was hearing. Because Professor Quirrell wasn't there to keep the silence anymore, and Azkaban was not, in fact, silent. Faint the woman's voice, repeating, "No, I didn't mean it, please don't die. No, I didn't mean it, please don't die." It got louder with every step Harry took. He could hear the emotion in the words now, the horror, the remorse, the desperation of, "No, I didn't mean it, please don't die." The woman's worst memory, rehearsing over and over again. "No, I didn't mean it, please don't die." The murder that had sent her to Azkaban. "No, I didn't mean it, please don't die." Where she was sentenced by the Dementors to watch whoever she'd killed die and die and die in an infinite repeating loop, though she must have been put in Azkaban recently from the amount of life left in her voice. The thought came to Harry then that Professor Quirrell had passed those doors, heard those sounds, and given not the slightest sign of disturbance, and Harry would have called it a positive proof of evil if Harry's own lips hadn't remained silent in the presence of Bellatrix, his breathing regular, while something inside him screamed and screamed and screamed. The Patroness brightened, not out of control, but it brightened with every step Harry took forward. It brightened further as Harry and Bellatrix descended the stairs. She stumbled, and Harry offered her his left arm thrust outside the cloak, braving the sense of doom from being that close to the snake draped around her neck. There was a surprised look on her face, but she accepted it and said nothing. It helped Harry, being able to help Bellatrix, but it wasn't enough. Not when he saw the huge metal door in the center of that level's corridor. Not when they came closer and the woman's voice fell silent because there was a Patroness near her now and she wasn't reliving her worst memory anymore. "Good," said a voice inside him. That was step one. Harry's steps carried him inevitably forward toward the metal door. And now unlock the door. Harry kept walking. "What do you think you're doing? Go back and get her out of there." Kept walking. "Save her. What are you doing? She's hurting, you have to save her." The portkey Harry was carrying could transport 2 humans, only 2 plus or minus a snake. If they'd had Professor Quirrell's portkey too. But they didn't. Professor Quirrell's human form was carrying that. There was no way to get it. Harry could only save one person today, and there was only one person on the lowest level of Azkaban, in the most desperate need. "Don't go." The voice came in a scream from behind the metal door. "No, no, no, don't go, don't take it away, don't. There was a light in the corridor, and it grew brighter. "Please," sobbed the woman's voice. "Please, I can't remember my children's names anymore." "Sit down, Bella," Harry's voice said. Somehow he kept his voice in a cold whisper. "I must deal with this." The hover charm diminishing and switching off even as Bella obediently sat down, her skeletal form dark against the brightening air. "I'll die," thought Harry. The air went on brightening. After all, it wasn't a certainty that Harry would die. It was just a probability of death, and weren't some things worth a probability of dying? The air went on brightening. The greater Patroness was beginning to form around him. The brilliant human shape was becoming indistinct within the burning air as Harry's life went to feed the fire. "If I wipe out the Dementors, then even if I live, they'll know it was me, that I was the one who did this. I'll lose my support, lose the war." "Yeah," said the inner voice that was urging him on. "After you destroy all the Dementors in Azkaban, I think that tend to prove your credentials as a light lord, actually, so save her, you have to save her." The humanoid shape could no longer be seen as a separate entity. The corridor couldn't be seen. Harry's own body was invisible within the cloak. There was only a bodiless viewpoint within an infinite expanse of silver light. Harry could feel the life leaving him, fueling the spell. Far away, he could feel the shadows of death begin to fray. "I meant to accomplish more with my life than this. I was going to fight the Dark Lord. I was going to merge the wizarding and muggle worlds." Lofty goals seemed very distant, very abstract, compared to one woman begging him for help. It wasn't certain that Harry would ever do anything more important than this one thing that he could do now and here. And with what might have been his last breath, Harry thought, there are other Dementors, probably other Azkabans. If I'm going to do this, I should do it when I'm closer to the central pit. It will take less of my life that way, which increases the probability that I'll survive to destroy other Dementors. Even assuming this is the optimal thing to do, if there's a right time and place to do this, it isn't now and here, it isn't now and here. "What?" said the other part of him indignantly, as it searched for a counter-argument that didn't exist. Slowly the light died back down, as Harry concentrated on that one indisputable fact. The one obvious truth that they weren't in the optimal place. The time couldn't be now. Slowly the light died back down. Part of Harry's life flowed back into him. Part had been lost as radiation. But Harry had enough left to stay on his feet and keep the silver human shape bright. And when his wand arm raised and his voice whispered, Wingardium Leviosa, the magic flowed obediently out of him and helped Bellatrix to her feet. For it wasn't his magic he had expended, it had never been his magic that fueled the Patronus charm. I swear, Harry thought, breathing as regularly as he could in Bellatrix's presence, while tears streamed down his invisible cheeks. I swear upon my life, and my magic, and my art as a rationalist. I swear by everything I hold sacred, and all my happy memories. I give my oath that someday I will end this place. Please, please may I be forgiven. And the two of them walked on, as a murderess's voice screamed and begged someone to come back and save her. There should have been more time. There should have been a ceremony for Harry's sacrifice of that piece of himself. But Bellatrix was beside him, and so Harry just had to keep on walking without a pause, saying nothing, breathing evenly. So Harry walked on, leaving a piece of himself behind. It would dwell in this place and time forever, he knew. Even after Harry came back someday with a company of other true Patronus casters, and they destroyed all the Dementors here. Even if he melted the triangular building and burned the island low enough that the sea would wash over it, leaving no trace that such a place as this had ever once existed, even then he wouldn't get it back. The flock of luminous creatures stopped staring downward and began patrolling the metal corridor as if nothing had happened. Just like last time. Director Bones snapped in the direction of Aura Lee, and the young Aura replied, "Yes, ma'am." The director fired off another query to see if the Dementors could now find their target, and looked unsurprised to hear a negative reply a few seconds later. Emmeline Vance was feeling torn between her loyalties. Emmeline wasn't a member of the Order of the Phoenix anymore. They had disbanded after the end of the last war. And during the war, they'd all known, that Director Crouch had quietly approved of their off-the-books battle. Director Bones wasn't Crouch. But they were hunting Bellatrix Black now, who had been a Death Eater, and who was certainly being rescued by Death Eaters. Their patronesses were behaving oddly, all the bright creatures stopping and staring off downward before they'd gone back to following their masters. And the Dementors couldn't find their target. It seemed to her that this would be an extremely good time to consult Albus Dumbledore. Should she just suggest to Director Bones that they contact Dumbledore? But if Director Bones hadn't contacted him already, Emmeline wavered for a while, probably too long, and then finally decided. The hell with it, she thought. We're all on the same side. We need to stick together whether Director Bones likes it or not. At a thought, her silver sparrow fluttered onto her shoulder. "Drop behind us to guard our rear," Emmeline murmured softly, almost without moving her lips. "Wait until no one is looking directly at you, then go to Albus Dumbledore. If he is not already by himself, wait until he is. And tell him this. Bellatrix Black is breaking out of Azkaban, and the Dementors cannot find her.